thought he'd be here.
Reckon I'm not him, but I ain't leaving you for the coyotes either.
Mail-order bride collapsed beside the tracks, and the cowboy who found her said, "You're coming home with me." Wyoming Territory, October 1879 dusk, at the edge of Cottonwood Station. The whistle's last cry tore through the valley and seemed to keep ringing inside her skull long after the locomotive had dwindled to a smear of smoke and iron. Steam drifted in ragged veils along the platform, mixing with dust kicked up by boot heels and wagon wheels, until the air itself tasted of rust and ash. Clara Whitmore stood with both hands on the leather handle of her trunk, as if clinging to a dock while a river ripped past. When the wind blew, grit needled the bruises along her jaw. She kept her eyes on the rails, twin lines of dull silver rushing west into a cut of pines, because looking at people meant seeing what was already written on their faces: curiosity, pity, or the mean pleasure of folks who love a spectacle. "Off the platform, miss," the conductor had said, voice flat, one hand already on the brass rail to haul himself aboard. He hadn't looked at her long enough to see the bloom of purple beneath her eye, or the way her glove was torn at the palm. The man who'd written the letters, the one who'd signed himself yours in anticipation, hadn't shown. The conductor had no time for ghosts or late grooms. The timetable ruled all. The train had hissed and rolled on, leaving the smell of coal and a long, lonely quiet. That quiet pressed in now. Clara swallowed against the dryness in her throat. A chalkboard nailed to the station wall rattled on its hook, announcing eastbound arrivals and westbound departures in a hand that leaned too hard on its downstroke. There would be no more trains until morning. The light was already slanting long and gold, then colder as a bank of clouds slid over the Sunday. She shifted her trunk. It thumped on the wooden boards like a body. "Just leave it there," said a man from the freight shed, his hat pulled low. He moved with the loose swagger of someone who'd never been hurried in his life. "Belongs to the depot now if the party ain't here to collect you." "It's mine," Clara said. Her mouth tasted of iron, the memory of a ring that should have been placed on her hand at the end of this ride. She didn't say that. She didn't say anything more. Words had been her currency in Boston, letters copied twice, sentences turned until they shone. Out here, words seemed to skitter away like frightened quail. The freightman Leland, someone had called him, scraped his thumbnail under the buckle strap and pried it up. "You got passage money?" he asked in a casual tone that made the hair lift on Clara's arms. "If you're fixin' to take the morning train back, there's fees to settle. Handling, storage, the like. I already paid." She drew herself straighter. Her corset bit into the tender place at her ribs where a hard knuckle had found her 2 nights ago on the car between Cheyenne and here. "My fiancé," the words snagged and tore in her throat. "He sent money for the return if plans changed." Leland's eyes were the color of bottle glass. His smile didn't climb high enough to be called a smile. "Plans done changed all right. I'm the one keeps the ledger, sweetheart. No such funds recorded." He used one toe to nudge her trunk toward the shed. "Now, you don't want to make trouble." The cold ran deeper all at once. Clara set her palm over the rough lid. "You can't." His hand flicked out, faster than her mind allowed. Leather glove to her wrist, squeeze at the thin bones there, a twist. Not much. Enough. The shock of pain hollowed her breath. He leaned in as if to sniff her fear. "Nobody can't? You ain't in Boston." Heat burned in her face, not just shame, anger, dangerous and bright. She wrenched free and took a step back, then another, until the edge of the platform nudged her ankles. A whistle from somewhere down the road startled the pigeons under the eaves. They fountained up like clapping hands. Leland's gaze slid over her, weighing, measuring, finding nothing of consequence. He jerked his chin at a boy loitering by the door. "Eli, take the trunk." The boy's fingers hesitated on the leather. He couldn't have been more than 12, freckles sprinkled across a nose raw from the wind. He looked at Clara. She tried to meet his eyes steady, the way her mother had taught her: never plead, never give them the pleasure, but the effort broke on a wave of dizziness. The boards under her boots seemed to tilt. The rails gleamed too bright. When she breathed, the air felt thinner than paper. "Miss?" the boy said. "Ma'am?" Her knees did not belong to her anymore. She sat without meaning to, then knelt, the wood biting through the thin skirt, and at last slid sideways to the gravel beside the tracks. The stones were still warm from the day's Sunday. She pressed her cheek to them and felt the grit grind into split skin. In the roar inside her head there was a memory, a thin, clean thread of river sound from childhood, the way water set all the truth to rights if you would only kneel and listen. There was no water here, only the metallic stink of the rail and the taste of dust. "Lord above," someone muttered. Boots came and went, the indifferent parade of town life skirting a fall it had seen before. Clara closed her eyes to spare her pride the sight of them watching. Her breath shortened to small, quick sips. She heard the freight man curse about fainting hens and useless baggage. Then all the nearby sounds narrowed, sharpened, until one remained. Hoofbeats, steady and unhurried, approaching along the cinder verge rather than the street, as if the rider didn't care to be seen until the seeing mattered. The rhythm slowed. A horse exhaled, soft and alive. Leather creaked. The shadow crossed her face hat brim, broad shoulder cooling her skin for a heartbeat. A voice followed, low as a prayer and made of dry mountain wind. "Easy." One word, and something inside her spine uncoiled a notch against her will. She tried to push herself up, but the world slid again. A hand appeared within the frame of her half-lidded vision, browned by sun, big enough to lift fence rails, with a faint white scar along the knuckle of the thumb. The hand didn't grab. It waited. "I can stand," she heard herself say, and the lie was thin as paper. "Sure," the voice said, purely matter of fact, as if agreeing cost nothing. "You'll do it better with help." She let him take her weight. He lifted as if she were no heavier than a field jacket, and for an instant her cheek found the coarse weave of a shirt that smelled of pine pitch and horse and clean sweat. He set her on the edge of the platform, nowhere near the freight man, nowhere near the boy who'd been pressed into other men's meanness. The rider, no. Not a rider now. A man on his feet, tall and built, like the country itself tipped 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. "Jonah Hale," he said, as if introducing himself before a church supper and not in the wreckage of another person's pride. "Ma'am." Clara's mouth worked, found nothing. Her vision cleared by degrees. She made out the horse behind him, a bay with a white star just off center on its forehead. The animal watched her with quiet curiosity, as if she were a foal fallen in an unexpected place. She saw the rifle scabbard at the saddle, the coil of rope looped neat, the saddlebags worn pale at the corners. And when she looked back at the man, she noticed the thing her fear had hidden. Gentleness in the set of his jaw. Not softness. Nothing soft about him, but a refusal to sharpen his edges against her. Leland came forward, pushing his hat up with the heel of his palm. "She ain't your problem, Hale," he said, making Jonah's name sound like dirt. "Depot business. She's trespassing besides. Ain't got fare, ain't got a sponsor, ain't got—" "Water," Jonah said without looking at him. The single word changed the air. He turned slightly, as if addressing the space around them rather than the man, and touched a hand to the canteen at his hip. "Ma'am?" Clara's tongue felt like old leather, but her fear of taking anything from a stranger fought with something older and truer. She nodded. He unscrewed the cap and held the canteen near, without pressing it on her. When she reached, her fingers brushed his. The skin there was warm. Her first sip was a miracle and a pain, both the water tasting of tin and cool shade, the swallow refusing, then surrendering. He tipped the canteen back when she would have gulped. "Slow," he said, "else it comes right back up." It would have been easy for Leland to make more of this than it was. He tried. "Now look here, she owes—" Leland didn't finish, because Jonah turned his head and let his eyes find the other man's. Nothing much happened in that look. No flaring anger, no spoken threat. Only a plain, steady ledgering that made Leland's bottle glass eyes slide away. Jonah's voice stayed quiet. "You done talking at her," he said. "Say what you need to say to me, Ev." The freight man swore and tipped his head, as if collecting the dignity he'd scattered. "She's on depot property. No funds, no home to go to. I'm doing my job. You want to play rescuer, you sign for liability." Jonah's hand flexed once, an absent working of muscle. "Reckon I'm not signing any damn fool paper you come up with." "Then she stays." "No," Jonah said. His tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. He set the canteen aside, took off his coat, and draped it around Clara's shoulders, with a care that made her throat ache deeper than thirst. The coat was heavy, smelling faintly of wood smoke, as if it had been hung too close to a stove at some point in its life. Its weight said, "You are not exposed." "Can you stand a step more?" he asked her, gentler again. "Yes." The word surprised her, because it was true. He guided her down from the platform, as if helping a woman from a carriage. The sky had gone the color of old spill iron gray bruised purple along the ridges. A wind ran the length of the tracks and set the grass to shiver. The horses' ears flicked toward them. When Jonah lifted Clara, no force, just that grounding steadiness, she felt small and safe, in a way that had nothing to do with helplessness. He set her sideways in the saddle first, to let the blood return to her head, then helped her turn. The bay shifted weight and stood square, patient. "What are you doing?" Leland demanded. A few men had come to the depot doorway, drawn by the gravity that gathers around trouble. "You can't just haul a woman off like a man with a home," Jonah said. He put one boot to the stirrup and swung up behind Clara. His presence settled along her spine, not pressing, not claiming, just there, the way a wall stands where it should. He gathered the reins with one hand and took the coat collar with the other, snugging it closer at her throat against the drop in temperature. Clara found she could breathe deep enough at last to smell the world, the damp iron of the rails cooling, the sour note of the depot, the clean animal scent of the bay, the faint resin of pine carried down from the hills. Her eyes burned. She kept them open and fixed on the far line of cottonwoods, where the tracks bent toward the mountains. Her whole body trembled once, and then, little by little, stopped. Behind them, Leland scoffed something that could have been bravery, or could have been the absence of it. Jonah touched his heels to the horse, and the animal stepped off the cinder into the sparse grass beyond, away from the platform and the chalkboard, and the women peering through lace at stories they'd tell over supper. They moved along the fringe of town where sage poked up through sand and the road rutted into the wash.
Reckon I'm
Only
not
then
him,
did Jonah speak
but I ain't
again,
leaving you for
the
the
words
coyotes
low
either.
and even beside her ear, the kind a person could rest their weight on without fear of them breaking. "You're coming home with me." The promise hung there in the cooling air. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder rolled slow and distant, like a giant turning over in his sleep. The horse picked up an easy jog. Clara's hand, she did not mean to found the front of the saddle and the warm strength of his forearm where it crossed in front of her. She closed her eyes just long enough to see the river in her mind again, and to hear it say that truth would come, because it always did when water was close. When she opened them, the town had already fallen behind. The dusk gathered in the pines ahead like a door easing shut, and from the depot platform, on a spur of track where no train would come tonight, a man with bottle-glass eyes turned and spat into the dust, then watched the bay and its two riders, until even the echo of their hoofbeats had gone. Clara woke to the soft crackle of burning pine and the scent of coffee gone a little bitter on the edge of a boil. For a moment she lay still, listening, because listening had always told the truth faster than any face. The wind was up, she could hear it skimming the cabin roof, pulling at whatever chink of bark or loose shingle offered itself. Somewhere metal tapped against metal in a steady, nervous rhythm. A hook on a chain, or a kettle lid trembling when the gusts pressed hard enough at the seams. Warmth cupped her on one side, not a bed, something lower and narrower. A pallet pulled close to the hearth, she realized, and a wool blanket that bore the dry fragrance of sun and soap. She knew the shape of a real bed well enough not to mistake one, and this wasn't it. Jonah Hale had laid her where the fire was, not where he slept. Her cheek rested on a pillow with a coarse, honest ticking. When she shifted, the ache rose in flares along her ribs, old bruises answering the new jostling of the ride, and the tender place at her jaw throbbed. A basin rattled somewhere beyond her line of sight, then stilled. "Thirsty?" The voice came low, near the floor rather than above her, as if he'd crouched to her level so the question wouldn't fall on her like an order. She turned her head carefully. He was near the hearth on his heels, sleeves rolled and forearms browned, steam climbing in a white thread from the mug in his hand. In the fire's light he looked less like a piece of the country, and more like a man who had taken the country into himself. Ash flecks on the hem of his shirt, a small scorched scuff at the edge of his boot, the calm of someone who had stacked and carried and mended until quiet competence had become a habit. "Yes," she said, and the word rasped like sand. He set the mug aside and lifted the basin. "Water first," he murmured. "Coffee after." He dipped a clean rag and squeezed it out till it stopped dripping, then offered it. "Touch your lips a little. Don't drink yet." The cloth was cool, shockingly clean. She pressed it to her mouth, and the simple mercy of moisture undid her for an instant. Tears came hot and uninvited. He didn't mention them, didn't hurry her. The wind worried at the eaves again until the cabin sighed, and in the sigh she found the presence of his silence. Patient, steady, with room inside it for her to be human. "How long?" she whispered. "Close to an hour since we got in." He rose to pour a palm of water into a tin cup and crouched again. "Take it slow." The first sip stayed. The second eased the knife in her throat to a blunt edge. She swallowed once more, and handed the cup back before her body begged past what it could handle. He nodded approval, as if she'd done something useful, and not simply followed directions. The cabin revealed itself by layers. A shelf with a Bible worn to soft corners. Pegs by the door, one holding a hat still beaded with damp where fog had found it. At the far wall, a narrow bed with a dark quilt folded tight, the military neatness of it telling its own small history. A table under a square-paned window. 2 chairs, a row of jars with beans and flour and salt, labeled in a careful hand that didn't look like his. There was a smell of damp leather somewhere under everything, like a saddle kept inside against the weather. "Where?" her voice faltered. "How far from town?" 6 miles if you take the proper road. 3 if you ride the way we did. He glanced toward the door as a gust licked around it and rattled the latch. "Storm's pushing out of the west. We had a head start. Close." She touched the bruise at her jaw and found it already cleaned. The sting told her someone had washed and salved it. Her fingers went to the edge of the blanket as if to hide inside the weave. "You?" He shook his head once. "My hands ain't gentle enough for the small hurts. Mrs. Granger's are. She came down the ridge when she saw me ride past with a woman on the bay. Lives a 1/4 mile up a widow. Wasn't much to do but wash the places that go to fever if we left 'em." His mouth flattened at the memory of some past failing he didn't give her. "She'll bring broth in the morning." "This is your home," Clara said. The obviousness of it suddenly a strange comfort, a stake she could pound into the day to keep it from blowing away. "And the horse?" "Bay's called Star," he said, almost apologetic, as if he ought to have chosen a name cleverer than the white mark on the horse's brow. "He knows the way better than I do on a night like this." Quote, the fire shifted and sent a brass of sparks up the throat of the chimney before settling again into its low hum. Jonah crossed to the stove, pulled the coffee off the heat, and let it sit. He did not ask her anything yet. There were questions all over the room. Who broke your lip? Who left you at the tracks? But he kept them where they belonged. In the future, when a person could lift them without making the wound worse. He crouched again with the basin. "May I?" he asked, a courtesy that hit her with more force than any medicine. She inclined her head. He dipped the cloth, wrung it out, and began at the safe places, the line of hair behind her ear, the temple where dust had settled, the cheek opposite the bruise. He was as careful as a man can be, with hands that had done heavy work all their life. When he reached the split in her lip, he stopped altogether, folded the cloth smaller, and let the edge of it kiss the cut, instead of dragging across. Her breath, which had been steady, went shallow. Something fragile and dignified inside her, something that had been trampled these last weeks, recognized the reverence in the ordinary action and wept without sound. She kept her face still. The heat from the fire broke over her in a slow, continual wave. Outside, the first cold pinpricks of rain stitched along the roof. "You're safe here," Jonah said. Not like a vow, not like a boast, only a statement joined to the crackle of wood. "I'll stable the bay and check the line before it blows harder. Then I'll come back and pour you half a cup of coffee you'll pretend ain't the best you ever had. After that, we're going to let the weather play itself out, and tomorrow we'll see what needs seeing." He rose to hang the cloth to dry near the hearth. She noticed the way he moved, nothing wasted. Her father had once said some men are born to leave a place better than they found it, or not leave at all. She had thought that a florid thing to say, the kind of talk men used to dress up work that was just plain work. Looking at Jonah, she began to understand what her father had meant. There was economy and care and a quiet sort of pride in how the simple tasks were done. "Mr. Hale," she said before he reached the door. He turned. She meant to thank him, truly. The word hovered and wouldn't cross her tongue, because there was so much to hitch to it that the syllables couldn't bear the load. "I can sleep on the floor," she said instead, and immediately felt foolish, the statement belated and useless when she was already on it. "I mean, I don't wish to put you out." "You ain't," he said. "I'll take the chair." "The chair?" The thing looked hard as a hymn book cover. He nodded once, as if breaking his back at a kitchen chair were the most natural plan a man could have. Then he let a tiny smile tilt his mouth. "You'll argue me out of it by chapter 2, he said, and she blinked at the oddness of the phrase until she understood he meant no book at all, just that by tomorrow or the next day she'd be well enough to insist on something more sensible. "Until then, we'll do it my way." He lifted the latch, and night pressed its wet cheek into the room. The brief square of darkness showed the yard a lean-to where the wood was stacked, the low black rib of the corral fence, pines crowding up against the cabin, as if they'd come down from the ridge to get warm. He was only gone a minute, maybe 2. The bay snorted, a small, offended sound at the rain, and a rope thunked against a post. The door shut, and the room held still again. He poured the coffee and brought it to her, then set himself on the floor near enough to the hearth that he could warm the backs of his hands with the spill of heat. "Blow on that," he said. "It'll scald you foolish otherwise." Steam lifted in a thin ribbon. The tin warmed her fingers even through the blanket. She took a sip and had to keep from closing her eyes at the way the bitterness woke the last parts of her that hadn't remembered they were still alive. "It is very good," she said with gravity. He accepted the praise with equal gravity, as if making coffee a woman could stand up on were no small portion of a day's work. A spool of silence unwound. It wasn't empty. It held the small sounds that promised safety. Rain on the roof, fire working its way deeper into the heart of a log, the little shift of a chair leg when a man begins to settle for a long watch. The cloth over the window puffed in and out with a faint, regular breath where the wind found a gap. "Mr. Hale," she said again, because if she was ever going to speak her story, she needed to hear how his name felt in her mouth. "Jonah, if that is acceptable." "Sounds fine." He tipped his head, acknowledging the gift of his given name from her. "My trunk," she said. There is a letter." He waited. "The man at the depot, Leland," she said, the name a burr. "He took money. There was meant to be—" She ran out of room in the sentence and started another. "I kept a copy of the agreement. The original went on ahead. I don't think it reached him. Or it did, and it didn't matter." She swallowed. "I don't know which is worse." "We'll fetch the trunk," Jonah said, "when the ground ain't soup." His eyes had gone a shade cooler, like creek water under cloud. "And we'll fetch the truth that goes with it." She nodded. The coffee had set a comfortable anchor in her belly. Her hands under the blanket had quit shaking. She looked around again and saw proof of another pair of hands in the place, patient and domestic. A small row of darning mushrooms in a chipped bowl, a length of mended curtain hem, stitches, so even they made a quiet beauty of what they were. "You said Mrs. Granger came to help," she said. Was there someone else who kept house here?" His gaze traveled to the neat bed and back. "Was," he said. The word landed soft but heavy. "My wife, Emma. Winter fever, 3 years gone." "I am sorry," Clara said. "You don't know her," he said gently. "You do," she answered, and let that stand. Rain drilled harder for a minute, then eased, then settled into a steady baptism. The smell of wet earth shouldered in under the smoke. Jonah rose to lay another log where the collapse of embers had made a hollow, then nudged the pieces together with the iron. Sparks jumped and died. When he turned back, she saw he'd brought a small tin of salve from the shelf and a length of clean linen. "May I tend that lip proper?" he asked. She nodded. He sat where she could see his hands and opened the tin. The smell of it, tallow and something green, took her back so fast to her mother's sewing chair, and the little jar she kept for winter cracks, that Clara had to keep her mouth steady to keep from making a sound. He folded the linen to a neat edge and took his time with each dab, as if to refuse the world's hurry. "You were on a train to a man who didn't come," he said after a long while, not prying, only setting an honest sentence on the table to see if she wanted to add to it. "Yes." The words sat there, damp and small. "He wrote letters. They were charming. He wrote that my hands sounded like church bells when I mentioned I could play. I don't know what that means, but it made me smile. He said he would be there. He said—" She stopped, picking her steps among the stones of memory, as if they might shift and throw her. On the way, a man boarded a different man. Leland met him when no one looked. There was whiskey. There was a night when someone banged my shoulder in the corridor and I bit my lip and kept quiet, because ladies keep quiet on trains. The night after that, someone came to the women's car door and said the rules had changed. Jonah's face didn't move, not a tick. Only the small muscle along his jaw tightened and eased. "You don't need to put those things into words for my sake," he said. "They belong to me," she said, surprising herself. "I'll say them when I choose and swallow them when I don't. Tonight, I don't." "All right," he said. The cabin gave a little shiver as the wind curled back on itself. She finished the coffee, and he took the cup, wiped it, set it upside down on the table, as if even now order mattered and could be found. Her eyelids had grown heavy. The fire's light breathed against the walls. The rain made a sound like reassurance when you stopped flinching at it. "If you wake in the night and forget where you are," Jonah said, taking his hat from the peg but not putting it on, "the door'll be latched, but not locked. I'm sitting right there." He nudged the chair with his boot. "No one gets in without waking me first and regretting it after." The chair looked narrow and unforgiving. "You can't sleep there." Quote, "Watchmen don't sleep. Are we besieged?" The ghost of a smile touched her mouth, and it hurt, and she let it hurt. "Not tonight," he said. "But habit's a hard thing to argue." She drew the blanket higher. The wool scratched in a way that felt good because it was honest. Beyond the window, the trees hissed under the rain like 1,000 whispered prayers. She closed her eyes. The palate accepted her weight. She might have slept an hour or a handful of minutes when a sound found its way into the room that didn't belong to storm or fire. It came thin through the continuing rain. First a tremor, then the sure thing. Hoofbeats, one horse, maybe two, sliding in the mud until the rider let them settle. The rhythm paused, like someone listening back. Clara's eyes flew open. The fire had fallen low, a red eye behind the grate. Jonah was already on his feet, the rifle in his hands as if it had been resting there all along. He moved to the window without shadow and eased a finger between curtain and frame. "What is it?" she whispered, the old panic fluttering, then sitting when it found his calm. He angled his head, listening. Out there, just beyond the dark pane, something breathed that was not wind. "Stay by the hearth," he said, voice quiet as before, only now with steel swum into it. "And if the latch lifts, and it ain't me on the other side of that door." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The rifle's lever clicked once, a clean mechanical promise. The rain went on falling, untroubled, as the hoofbeats settled into the yard and the night held its breath to see who would knock. Dawn came clear and thin, the kind that lifts itself out of the mountains on a breath held all night. A pale wash of light pressed at the window seam and turned the smoke above the hearth the color of skimmed milk. When Clara opened her eyes, the first thing she noticed was the smell. Coffee dark as earth, wood ash cooled to sweetness, and damp pine from the jacket Jonah had hung to dry on a peg by the door. The wind had gentled to a whisper that threaded the chinks between logs, less a threat now than a reminder the world still moved around them. She lay quiet, measuring pain the way a seamstress tests a thread between finger and thumb. The deep bruise under her ribs had gone from knife to dull stone. The split on her lip had sealed at the edges beneath the salve, tugging only when she swallowed. The sleep she'd taken had been honest sleep, heavy and whole, not the fitful dozing she knew from train nights and the last sick weeks on the road. Jonah's chair sat where it had the night before, angled so a man could turn quickly to the door or the hearth if either called his name. It was empty now. The latch rested easy, and the floorboards near the threshold took a faint print of wet boot soles tracking in a crescent and out again. She could follow the story of his morning from those small signs. His going out to the lean, to at first light, the return with wood, the coffee boiled, the coals stoked into red, the care taken to keep the cabin's breath steady, while the world shook off its storm. She pushed the blanket aside and rose carefully. A tug at her scalp told her a braid had given up somewhere in the night, and when she touched the tangle he had not seen fit to smooth, a small laugh shook loose inside her chest light and startled as a bird. That was new, laughter that didn't feel borrowed. On the table, beside the 2 cups and the coffee pot in its neat sock of burlap, lay a folded scrap of paper with her name written on it in blocky letters that tried for fine but landed square. Miss Whitmore. Went to throw feed and check the north fence for blowdowns. I'll be at the corral. Coffees ought to be drinkable. Water's warming if you want to wash. Don't step out till I look for mud. I'd rather you didn't court the ground today. J. Hale. The last line bent her mouth again, gently at the corners. She poured herself half a cup and blew across it until the steam calmed. The first swallow took her to Boston for a breath parlor coffee with a shine, poured from a porcelain pot by a woman wearing rings. But this cup returned her at once to Wyoming. The taste of tin and pot bottom and the honest bitterness of a day started before it needed a name. She found a tin basin warming at the hearth edge. The water had picked up a whisper of smoke and something mineral from the kettle, and when she dipped the clean rag and pressed it to her cheek, the heat worked kindness into places her skin had forgotten were hers. She washed slow, the way Jonah had, beginning where it hurt least. The face that returned from the wavering basin's surface looked like someone who had crossed a long field in bad weather and hadn't yet learned her own outline again. A stranger with her eyes steady as someone about to speak the truth. She set the basin aside and took in the cabin with the ease daylight allowed. The quilt on his bed carried a pattern of stars pieced in indigo and brown, the stitches small and patient. A woman's hands had made it, and the line of wear down the middle said it had covered more than one winter. On the shelf above the table, a tin of coffee, a jar of salt, a crock with a wooden spoon standing in it like a flag of truce. On the sill, a tiny bottle with a single stem of dried Indian paintbrush, the color of a rusted hinge. In the corner near the door, a lariat coiled the way. A man coiled his thoughts. No kinks, no knots, just held. When she lifted her trunk strap to move it closer to the hearth, the leather groaned, and the sound folded her back into herself. The trunk had been with her on the last train east to bury her father, on the first one west, when hope had felt like a coin shining in the palm. It wore the scuffs of station steps and the chalk of porters' palms. Leland's thumb mark had left a crescent of grime near the hasp where he had forced it, then thought better. She knelt, tested the lock. It held. Her name was still there on the pasted label, faded but legible. Clara Whitmore, Boston. Under that Cottonwood Station, Wyoming Territory, a future arranged in ink. She drew a breath and lifted the lid. The air inside smelled faintly of lavender that had traveled too far and given itself away to dust. On top lay the folded dress she'd saved for the day the letters promised, simple blue as a soft September. Her mother had hemmed it by lamplight. The winter the coughing kept them in, and the line of stitches wandered a little where a fit had taken her by surprise. Beneath it, a shawl gone to pills, a pair of kid gloves that had seen better rooms, a psalter with notes in a neat hand. At the bottom, tucked between the boards and the lining, where she'd slid it before the conductor could hurry her, lay the duplicate of the marriage agreement and the letters she had copied to keep herself from believing she had imagined them. She eased the papers out and set them on the table, waited with the coffee cup until the curl of them relaxed. Her eyes tracked the words she had memorized on lonely nights. Character upright, income sufficient, a good Christian home, passage paid, a bride received with honor. Ink that had once laid a path had dried into a map of a country that didn't exist. She traced the signature Victor Leland, agent, and felt a small, hard, quiet gather at the base of her throat where panic had lived before. Bootfalls sounded outside measured. A man not needing to explain himself to the morning, and then the scrape of a boot against the sill as Jonah knocked once and let himself in. His hat carried a halo of damp on the brim. His hair beneath it had taken on the stubborn wave water gives a man who'd rather it didn't. He brought the smell of the yard with him, wet earth and horse, and the green bone scent that rises from fence posts when the sun thinks about returning. "How's the ground?" she asked, surprising herself with how the domesticity of the question didn't feel borrowed. "Clings like a promise," he said, "but the worst of it's dropping off the slope. You can put a foot down without losing it." He set his gloves by the hearth, palm up, like two tired animals. His glance found the open trunk. He didn't step toward it, didn't angle for a better look. He simply nodded once, as if to say a person has a right to her own belongings. "I made coffee," she said. "I drank mine with the horse," he answered, and that picture man and animal sharing steam while the light sorted itself out brought a warmth she hadn't expected to feel for a place she'd only just learned existed. He took a piece of kindling between thumb and forefinger and used it to shepherd an ember into a brighter state. "I was thinking," he said, not like a man given to saying so, "if you've the strength for it, we might walk to the corral. Star likes a proper greeting from anyone he carried in out of a scrape." "I'd like that," she said, and found she meant it. "I can manage." He tended the fire to a hold and then offered his arm without making ceremony of it. Outside, the world wore the aftermath of storm. The sky scoured pale, water standing in hoofprints like a dozen small mirrors, pine boughs dropping their caught rain in glistening beads that plinked onto the ground with the occasional cheerful sound of coin-meeting tin. The air felt washed. A creek woke somewhere down the slope, the new run of it chuckling as if remembering a joke. They walked slow, not because of her, but because of the earth's softness. Each step pressed a faint signature into clay. Each lift made a quiet pop as the ground released them. The corral was a low square of weathered rails, with a gate patched in two places by someone who respected thrift enough to make it honest. The bay star stood with his hind leg cocked, drowsy and content, as a man after a good meal. When he saw them, he blew a small note through his nose, and came to the fence with that careful curiosity horses carry when they hope for something nice. Clara lifted a hand, palm out. The soft triangle of Star's muzzle found it and breathed her in. The warmth of him rose through her skin into bone, and the steadiness of that life, simple, strong, unconcerned with ledgers and letters, worked on her like medicine. He bumped her fingers with his whiskered lip in a way that had to be called polite. "Good morning," she said, and the words felt as if they'd gone a long way to find their proper use. "Scratch here," Jonah said, pointing beneath the jaw where the hair swirled. "He pretends he don't care till you get the right spot. Then he shows poorly how he always did." She found the place, and Star's lower lip drooped in pleasure. Jonah's smile took its time. Not explosive, but bright enough, when it reached his eyes, to take some of the frost out of a morning. Beyond the corral, the country opened like a book, a sward of meadow running up into a stand of pine, the ridge dark with fur on its shoulders, a line of cottonwoods, marking where the ground remembered water even when it tried to forget. A hawk drew circles so clean in the sky, it made a person believe in invisible compasses. "Is this all yours?" she asked, before she could weigh the intrusion. "No," he said. "Land's no one's and everyone's until a man runs fence, and then it's his for as long as the fence holds. I've got enough. I'll not pretend otherwise." He said it without swagger, simply acknowledgement of the work behind the fact. "Enough," she repeated, and let the words sit between them like bread set on a table where two people have earned it. They fed the horses from a scoop of oats. The sound of grain hitting wood had that particular cheerfulness that belongs to morning chores done in the right order. Jonah showed her how to hold the curry and move it with the hair, not against. She learned the rhythm of the circles, the small puff of dust, the shine that comes not from polish but from renewed blood under skin. He didn't touch her hands to guide them. He mirrored the movement on the other side of the horse until their work matched without crowding. A pair of magpies hopped the fence and scolded indiscriminately, their tails like punctuation to a language only they understood. In the highlight, a drop of water hanging from the corral rail caught the sun and turned to a small star. Clara watched it swell and let go, and when it fell, she felt a matching pull in her chest, something like grief, something like relief, finding the courage to drop. By the time the curry came smooth through the shoulder, Clara's breath had found a pace that didn't cost her. She leaned her temple to the warm curve where neck met withers, and let that simple glory, a living beast, tolerating her closeness, wash what needed washing inside. "Hungry?" Jonah asked. "Yes," she said with a candor that would have embarrassed her a week before, and did not now. They walked back, Star following to the gate as if to say he'd accept more company if it were on offer. Inside, Jonah set a skillet on the stove, tipped in bacon ends he'd cut from a slab, and stood with his hand on the handle like a man who knows when to interfere with heat and when to let it have its way. The kitchen filled with the smell of salt and smoke. He handed her a bowl of cornmeal and showed her how he liked the batter. A little thicker than a city lady would approve, a little thinner than a trail cook would tolerate. When she stirred, the spoon drew slow constellations in the yellow. "Folks might call this breakfast," he said, "if they're generous. If they're prideful, they call it dinner and claim they own the Sunday." He said it deadpan, and the smallest thread of humor wove through the room and took its seat. Welcome. They ate at the table without ceremony, backs to the window so the light would fall where they could use it. The bacon was crisp at the edges, and he drizzled a spoonful of molasses from a stubborn jar over the corn cakes in a way that felt both decadent and deeply local, as if this were what molasses had always meant to do with itself since it first got poured. "Slaras appetitesurast her." The first cake vanished into the engine her body had become without consulting her pride. The second she ate more slowly, honoring each bite with the patience a person gives when they've learned not to take any mouthful of food for granted. Coffee washed it down. The heat unfurled in her limbs like the first length of laundry, letting go of winter's stiffness in spring Sunday. Jonah set his fork down and rested forearms on the table. He fixed his gaze not on her but on the far edge of the wood, as if to let the question look at a neutral object. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I aim to go into town this afternoon for fence wire and a bolt for the gate that went soft in the storm. I can bring Sheriff Merritt word about Leland. Or we can wait and let your letter speak first. I'll not drag you through a crowd before you're ready." He turned his eyes to her then, but I'll not leave him to do as he likes either. Quote, she put her palms flat to the table and felt the roughness of the grain meet the delicate maps of her hands. The letters lay between them, weighted by the coffee cup, the agent's promises and untruths mixed like silt in floodwater. "I want the truth where others can see it," she said, finding the steadiness she'd promised herself in the night. "But I need one day to be a person instead of a spectacle. Today. Please." "That's yours," he said. "And tomorrow is too. You tell me where to walk and I'll walk, or I'll stand, either way." He tapped the letters with a finger that knew its force and gave none. "We'll make copies at the telegraph office when we choose to. Things have a way of going missing when they shouldn't. "I kept a copy," she said, and the quiet pride in that made them both smile. He washed the skillet, and she dried it, and the work of those simple acts made a harmony. She could feel the weight of his grief in the neatness of the place Emma's quilt, Emma's jar labels, yet there was room here in the order for other hands to move without offense. He did not hover. He pointed once at the hook where the cloths hung and once at the shelf where the plates lived and left her to any further discoveries herself. After, he brought in a small basket from the peg by the door. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, setting it down. Inside lay useful things and beautiful ones that had no need to be. A darning egg with a faint burnish from 100 stockings, a packet of needles cushioned in flannel, a length of narrow ribbon the color of watered wine, bits of thread rolled on paper like tiny hay bales, and a thimble dented in a way that made a history of the finger that had worn it. "Mrs. Granger?" Clara asked, touching the ribbon as if it might shiver. "Emma," he said. "Mrs. Granger keeps her own basket nearer the stove. This one's lived by that peg since, before I learned not to trip on it." She lifted the thimble, felt its weight, then set it down and breathed out. The room received her breath and did not make commentary of it. "Would you like the window curtain mended?" she asked. "I noticed the hem." He glanced, and the corner of his mouth moved. "I've been noticing that hem for the better part of a year. It would be a kindness." Claude. She took her place at the table with the mending, and lost herself in the kind of work that turns thought to thread and orders it. The act of making small things right steadied her mind where large rightness had been refused. She stitched, and the morning breathed around her. Jonah stepped in and out once, to bring in a new armload of wood, once to set a pail under the eaves, where a steady drip had gathered like a tame spring, once to check the chicken coop for the egg his lone hen offered the world every other day when it pleased her. He brought the egg back with the embarrassed pride of a man who knew one egg was both not enough and exactly what they had. Near midday, Tucker rode up the trail on a sorrel who looked like trouble in church. Tucker was a man built like two fence posts, leaning into each other for strength. His beard a complicated map of grizzled decisions. He swung down without asking whether he should, and knocked once as he should have, and then opened the door because the house had known him longer than it had known a good many truths. "Morning, miss," he said to Clara with that particular courtesy older cowhands keep for women who stand upright in bad wind. He tipped his hat and then nodded at Jonah. "Fence held better'n it had any right to. I figured the creek would carry off the south run, but it just swelled and laid itself down. Saw tracks I didn't like near the cottonwoods, though. One horse, shod in front, barefoot behind. Stop and start, like a man thinking it over." Jonah took the news without altering the line of his shoulders. "He come this far, came up to the bend, where a person could see the cabin if he wanted to," Tucker said. "Then he decided he wanted to live through the day and turned east." Clara's hands found each other in her lap and held. Jonah's glance brushed her and returned to Tucker. "You go on to town?" "I aim to, but the sorrel aimed me back," Tucker said, and the horse outside snorted in proud confirmation. "She don't care for Merritt's new deputy. Neither do I." Jonah's mouth twitched. "That why your jacket's tore?" "That and the fence post that jumped under me," Tucker said. He rolled a shoulder to see if it still worked and winced as if pleased to find it did. "Heard talk last night down Cottonwood way. Leland was at the saloon buying courage in case he found any spare lying around. Told a story that put you, Jonah, in the middle of taking what ain't yours. He thinks if he throws enough words, some'll stick." Jonah drew a breath that said more than any cussing. "Sheriff hear it?" "Merritt hears things before they're said," Tucker answered. "He's letting the talk hang itself. But a lie with a purse behind it walks faster than a truth on foot." Clara reached for the letters on the table and held them as if to ballast herself against the old helplessness that wanted to climb her ribs. She felt Jonah watching not the paper, not her hands watching her for the crack where fear might get in. "Tucker," Jonah said, "you take the squatter's path and keep an eye on the east draw for me. I'll run into town before the day tips. If I'm not back by dark, it'll be because the wire clerk talked too long about cheap stock." He looked at Clara. You'll have Mrs. Granger for company. I'll fetch you a set of newsprint if the office has last week's. It ain't literature, but it's words laid out proper." Tucker sniffed. "You'll fetch more than print. You'll fetch a deputy's attention without trying. Leland's a small man who thinks a badge belongs to whoever whispers at it." He touched the brim of his hat at Clara again. "Ma'am," he said, and stepped out into the pale. The room held quiet for a breath after the door closed. Outside, Tucker said something colorful to the sorrel. The sorrel answered, and the two of them negotiated until the horse agreed to act as if she'd forgotten her hard opinions. Their hoofbeats went away up the trail, fading into the steady talk of the little creek. Jonah stood, pushed his chair back with a careful scrape, and busied himself with his hat brim in a way a man does when the thing he wants to say looks like a kind of asking. "I won't be long," he said. "You got a mind to set me any errand besides what I named?" Clara looked down at the mended hem in her lap, and then up at him, and felt an impulse so plain it surprised her with its lack of caution. "Bring back the paper," she said, "and, if they have it, a bit of thread the color of that ribbon. It is not necessary." She steadied her voice. "But I like the idea of finishing what someone else began." "That's one of the only good ideas a body gets," he said. He reached for the letters. She slid them toward him. He tucked them into his inside pocket, then patted the place absently, as if to tell them to behave. "Door stays latched," he said, and she nodded. "Mrs. Granger will come over when her soup tells her it can be left alone to practice being soup without supervision." When he stepped close to take his rifle from the pegs, the brim of his hat shadowed his eyes. She saw the lines there that life had drawn without asking permission, and the patience it took to pretend they didn't smart. "Jonah," she said, testing the name where it mattered. He paused. "Don't let him sell you a smaller truth than the one we own." Quote. He tipped the hat once, and the smallest grin, quick, felt more than seen cut the seriousness. "I don't buy lies wholesale," he said, and went. She listened to the steady sequence, latch, step, porch, earth, the rhythm of a man's weight when he goes toward something he would rather not leave someone else to meet. She stood a long moment at the window, not to watch him go, but to teach her heart the shape of the country that would be hers, at least for today. Pines breathing, creek talking, sky opening its clean palm above the ridge. The afternoon bent itself to domestic work the way a willow leans toward water. Mrs. Granger arrived with parsley flecking her apron like confetti from some private celebration. She had a face made of firm kindness and did not ask for the story. As she chopped onions into the pot, she only permitted a person to tell it if they discovered telling relieved something too heavy to haul. They talked of safer things. The late frost that had pinched the beans. The marshal's new baby that slept like a judge and woke like a storm. Clara hemmed until the light went tender and tired. She boiled a cloth in plain water and wiped the table until a shine came up from the grain. She set Jonah's cup beside hers and pretended for a minute that this had always been the place where her hands knew to set it. When she stood, her body protested in all the small good ways that say you have labored at last for yourself and not for fear. The day eased toward evening. The sun found a seam in the western clouds and poured through it like spilled brass. Gold ran along the fence rails, caught and held in stars' mane, struck the edge of the window glass so a shard of sunlight landed on the table by the letters and made them bright for a breath before the light slid away. Hoofbeats came then one horse, pace steady, rider tall in the saddle. Clara's heart rose to meet the sound, and then checked against caution. She moved to the window and lifted a corner of curtain. It was Jonah, dust chalking his boots, hat pushed back like a man who had used up part of the day's grace and found he still had enough to get home. He swung down, tied the bay, came to the door, and knocked the way he had, even though the latch might have learned his name by now. When she opened, the smell of town came with him, iron of the telegraph wire, yeast from the bakery that managed to scorch its loaves 3 times a week, the sour whisper of the saloon that lived in boards and never left. He set a paper on the table. 2 days old, he said, but its words all the same, and thread closest I could find. He produced a small coil from his pocket. It wasn't the exact shade, but it managed an argument for being kin. "Sheriff took your copies," he added, tapping his pocket where her duplicates had been. "Filed 'em with a hand to witness. Said Leland's gone quiet since last night. Quiet like a snake under a trough." Mrs. Granger clucked. "Snakes don't talk because they don't need to. That's their talent. You'll eat," she told Jonah, as if he had questioned the concept. She fetched bowls as if the universe had been waiting all day for the moment a spoon might make a good sound against their sides. They ate. The soup let them. Light softened. A star showed itself where the sky ripens first. Conversation, such as it was, drifted toward harmless shores and stayed there until the bowls stacked, and Mrs. Granger took herself off with the regal rustle of a woman who knows she has been useful and will be again. After dark, Jonah lit the lamp low. The flame made a clean oval in the glass and threw a coin of light onto the table. He reached into his coat and set down the original letters. "Telegraph clerk made a rough hand copy in his book," he said. "We have 3 of everything now where we had 2. That's one more than a lie generally likes." She touched the paper, then let her hand stay. "Thank you," she said, and it felt like too thin a garment for the fact, and had to serve anyway. He shrugged half of it aside. "Tomorrow we can—" A sound cut across his words, sharp and wrong in the honest weave of evening. The quick splintering rip of canvas, the slam of a gate chain thrown off its notch, and a horse's sudden scream, a sound that tears a person at the root if they love anything that runs on 4 good legs. Jonah's head snapped up. The lamplight put a small blade along his jaw. "Barn," he said, already moving. Clara was on her feet without thinking. The night took the door from her hand and threw it wide. Out in the yard, the dark had taken shape into a leaner shadow inside. Shadows, a man slipping along the fence line, hand on the latch of the corral, hat brim pulled low. Star reared, struck the rail with iron and fury, sent a shock through the woods so clean it hummed. The figure turned at the noise, and for one bright slice of a second, the lamp glow from the cabin caught his face. Bottled glass eyes, a mouth twisting around a word he hadn't earned the right to say. "Leland." He flung himself at the gate chain. The link slipped. The gate swung. Star surged toward the opening, not to run but to strike. The man stumbled backward, threw an arm up as if to ward off a consequence he'd ordered for others without expectation of his own share, and then reached for something at his belt that flashed dull in the last smear of day. "Inside," Jonah said, but he was already past her, already between the man and the animal, already where a choice could get him hurt, and would anyway. Clara grabbed for the lamp, snuffed it with her fingers, and the yard fell to raw night, the kind where a person must become either brave or still. Out beyond the fence, the creek took a breath and held it. Somewhere back along the trail, an answering hoofbeat, another rider lifting into a run, broke into the hush like the word "no," finally finding its voice. The yard broke into motion all at once. The gate chain clanged. Star struck the rail, and the man at the fence flinched backward with his hand yelling metal in the lamplight's steel at his belt, not shame in his bones. And then the light died in Clara's fingers because she had smothered it, and the dark took the world for its own. "Inside," Jonah said. But he was already past her, already where danger makes a man visible to himself. Leland's breath showed white in the cool. "Get that horse back," he snarled. And even in the dark, his voice held the oily slide it had on the platform. "You don't want him to—" Star slammed his shoulder into the rail again, a crack like a rifle shot. The gate sagged more, chain hanging ugly in the angle. Jonah stepped in tight and low and caught the headstall before the bay's forefeet climbed the night. "Easy, boy," he said. The words poured like water down the length of muscle, calm entering a body as surely as fear. "Easy, Star. Not tonight." Clara saw the arc only because it cut the stars. Leland's arm, the knife, and then Jonah's hand caught the wrist with a sound like a hawk striking. The blade fell. Grass received it. Steel kissed rock. Star leaped sideways and tore the gate loose the rest of the way. Jonah pivoted to keep from taking the hoof in his ribs, swung Leland's arm down, and drove the man into the fence where cedar met bone with a bounce. Boots hit dirt at a run from the trail. A second shadow slid under the pines. "Don't shoot," Tucker barked into the dark, and the way he said it told Clara someone had taught him once how ready the world was to oblige a different order. "It's just me." The sorrel snorting took on an insulted tone at having to stop moving fast. "Lantern," Jonah said without turning. Clara already had the tinder from the shelf. Her hands remembered work when terror forgot it, and the wick caught wrong once, then right. A small sun coming back. She lifted it, and the yard leaped into shape, star blowing hard, the gate crooked and suffering, the dirt chewed to paste where a man had backpedaled across it. Jonah's body made a wall between Clara and Leland. Tucker came, boots careful through mud, jaw set like a man who'd known too many nights that started this way. Leland found his bluster first. "This is a hell of a welcome," he said, voice gone thin with outrage. He wore like a borrowed coat. His hat was still on. The rain had pressed a dent in it that made him look smaller. "You strike me, Hale? You got witnesses to you laying hands on a man minding his business?" "Your business," Jonah said, holding him there as if the fence nail behind Leland's shoulder were the only thing in Wyoming keeping the man upright, "is other people's losses." He let go. "You come to my gate in the night with a knife. That's a kind of accounting, I understand." Leland smoothed his jacket with shaking hands. His eyes, bottle-glass green even in this light, cut to Clara and away again, repelled by what he had done and greedily circling for what he could do next. "The lady owes fees," he said. "The depot don't carry charity for Eastern girls who aim to trade up. I came for what's due." "Come back in daylight with a ledger," Tucker advised, voice mild in a way that meant the opposite. "Your knife done slipped out your hand. That muddles your case." Quote. Leland's gaze found the knife lying in the muck by the broken gate. He didn't reach for it with two men watching and a horse ready to put a hoof wherever it would be remembered most. He scaled his voice down to a neighbor's complaint. "Then I'll come back with the sheriff," he said, making sheriff sound like theater. "And we'll call it proper. Meanwhile, I'll take what's mine." He stepped toward the open gate. "Stop," Clara said. She didn't recognize her own voice. It came from further down in her than fear could reach. She had the lantern up and held, and its light made a clean circle around her bare knuckles. Leland halted because the light stopped him, because the sight of a woman he could no longer ignore bothered whatever machinery in him refused to name itself. "You don't own me," she said. "You sold a promise you never meant to deliver. You took the money from the letters and drank it into a silence you expected me to keep. If there are fees, they are due to the truth." "Fees are due at my office," he snapped. "If you want your Eastern baubles back, you'd best—" "My trunk is here," she said, steady now. "And so am I." She turned to Jonah, not because she needed permission, but because the act anchored her to something that would not chew and spit her like gossip. "Please close the gate." Jonah lifted the chain. He set the gate into its hinge with that practical tenderness that says a man plans to live here tomorrow, too, then looped what was left of the chain twice and made a new truth out of metal that had meant something else a minute ago. Leland's mouth bent. "Your hero's keen for theft," he said. "He's keeping you without name or license." He pointed a shaking finger at Jonah like a child pointing at the sky and calling it at fault. "I say, he's got a mind to use the girl and toss her when his kind of morning comes." Tucker snorted laughter that wasn't kind. "I've known Jonah Hale to throw a lot of things, rocks, rope, his back into work. I ain't yet seen him throw a woman." Starr blew a breath across Leland's shoulder that ruffled the man's collar. Leland stepped sideways and tried for dignity. "I'm going to town," he announced. "Sheriff Merritt'll be interested to hear there's trouble in his county." He took 2 steps backward and then turned, found his horse by sound, hauled himself up in a way that told a man he'd learned livery before saddle. "Keep the girl," he flung over his shoulder, mean with failure because he'd come expecting to win. "You'll wish you hadn't." He kicked the horse harder than necessary. Dirt spat. The dark took him. For a few heartbeats, the yard only held breathing horse. Men, the soft thread of Clara's own breath as her body reminded her it was still doing its work. The lantern flame thinned and steadied where her hand steadied. Crickets recovered their courage one by one and added their small, indifferent song. Tucker retrieved the fallen knife and turned it in his palm. "That ain't a fence knife," he said. "That's a town knife." Jonah nodded once. He lifted his eyes to the north ridge the way a man looks where a threat might grow itself overnight. Then he turned to Clara. "You all right?" She expected herself to say yes, the way a woman says it so men can keep their edges strong, but what left her mouth was truer. "I will be." And then, because fear must be taught who lives here, she said, "Now." "Good," Jonah said, and the word went into the dark the way a stake goes into dirt. "We'll put another brace on that gate at first light." Tucker. "Already got a plank by the lean-to," Tucker said. "I'll sit out yonder by the cottonwoods till dawn, if it suits you. Man who comes at night don't always learn how to stop his feet by morning." "It suits me," Jonah said. They did not sleep much after that, but what rest they took was the kind that says, "We are not alone." At gray, Jonah and Tucker had the new brace in. By full dawn, the yard looked like a place that had not held knives in the night. Mrs. Granger arrived with something she called oatcakes, and with a look that told Clara the widow had come armed, too, with her old husband's Navy Colt in a bag under the bread. She didn't mention it, and neither did anyone else. The world went on in its ordinary ways, while all of them waited for the part where it wouldn't. It came at mid-morning, when the light had climbed into clean, untroubled blue. Dust rose on the lower road, like a thought a town had been thinking all night. Two riders. Sheriff Merritt took the lead at a pace that said, "I aim to see but not to be led." The new deputy rode behind with the posture of a man hired by a hand that wasn't the law. Leland came at their shoulder, face smoothed into wounded citizen. Merritt swung down easy, the way men do who like and trust their own boots. He was tall and spare and carried his badge like a tool, not a charm. "Morning, Jonah," he said. "Ma'am?" He touched his hat to Clara. His gaze took one quiet tour of the yard, the fixed gate, the scuff of night argument still bruising the dirt, and returned to Jonah. "Morning," Jonah said. "Mr. Leland here alleges there was an incident last night," Merritt continued, voice even as a level. "Says you set on him without provocation. Says you've got property of the depot without paper to claim it." "Mr. Leland came to my gate with a knife," Jonah said. "I took the knife off him and suggested he try sunlight next time." He gestured small to Tucker, who had moved into a part of the yard where a man sees all the edges. Tucker stood witness. My gate stood witness, for that matter. "And the lady?" Merritt asked, not like a man who doubts, but like one who lets a person add their own name to a sentence, if they want it there. Clara stepped forward with the letters held plain. "He took money," she said. "He promised papers that never arrived. Sheriff, I have duplicates." She offered them. Merritt took the sheaf and read the top with the patience of a man who had spent long winter evenings learning how words do and don't tell the truth. Leland's deputy leaned his elbow on his saddle horn and smirked. "Looks to me like a lot of Eastern writing," he said, and it was not the words, but the way he said Eastern, that turned the air colder. "Merritt, the law's simple. A woman ain't a parcel to be kept outside the depot. And she ain't a parcel to be inventoried by a drunk, Mrs." Granger observed from the step, voice as level as a quilting frame. "Deputy Cotter, you watch how you aim your words around my porch." Merritt cleared his throat, not to silence her, but to keep the air from turning ugly in a hurry. He turned a page. "Mr. Leland," he said at last, "you have receipts to show money changed hands from this woman to your account?" Leland produced a slip with flour on it. Some paper always keeps the same company, and Merritt read that too. "What I see here," he said, "is a record of funds received for passage and arrangement. It ain't a bill of sale for a human being. It ain't permission to show up in the night with a blade." Leland puffed, eyes bright with self-pity. "So the law's on the side of squatters now? Man keeps another man's property, Sheriff. That man's a thief." Merritt folded the papers back to Clara and met Jonah's eye. "I'm not hauling anyone off for theft of his own gate," he said, "but I am going to haul someone to town before he talks himself into making a hole the size of a jail around his own feet." He looked at Leland and then at Jonah again. "The saloon's full of ears. They heard a version already. I need a quiet room for the other." Jonah nodded. "You want me to come," he said, a question becoming a fact. Merritt answered with a tilt of his head that admitted how little he liked what he needed. "Voluntary's sweeter to drink than iron," he said. And the iron hung in the space anyway because Deputy Cotter had already slid his hand toward a cuff like a boy itching to try his new toy. "I'll ride in," Jonah said. "No," Leland said sharply, triumph peeking through the torn cloth of civility. "You take him in, Sheriff. Folks ought to see you don't play favorites." Merritt's jaw moved once, resigned and irritated at the same time. "Folks ought to see justice," he said, but he lifted a hand and Cotter stepped forward, almost smiling. The deputy took Jonah's wrist and turned it, not rough but with relish, and the cold circle of iron closed and spoke its small, ugly truth into a quiet yard. Clara felt the world climb her ribs, the old panic, the trained obedience that says, "Let it happen. You can't stop any of it," and then she felt something else set itself in her bones, like a post tamped firm. She stepped to Jonah's side before she could talk herself out of it and put her hand over the cuff. Not to pull it off she couldn't, but to put the living heat of her palm between iron and the story it wanted to make. "I will come," she said to Merritt. "I will speak in your quiet room. I will stand in your loud one, too." Leland snorted. "What you'll do, girl, is wish you'd kept your mouth shut." Clara lifted her face to him and saw he did not know her at all. "I did that for a whole train," she said softly. "It didn't help." Merritt's eyes warmed a fraction. "All right," he said, "we'll have the telling. Mrs. Granger, would you do me the kindness of walking the lady in after she collects what she needs?" "Tucker." "I'll ride ahead," Tucker said, already swinging up. "Put a back on a bar stool for the sheriff. Keep Cotter's friends busy counting their fingers." "Good," Merritt said. He looked at Jonah. "You'll have your say." "I will," Jonah said. He glanced at Clara then and gave her something like a nod that meant, "Don't fret none on my account. Save it for the part that needs it." But his mouth gentled at the corners, and for a heartbeat the iron between his wrists looked like a thing the world had put there by mistake. "See to Star," he said, "practical even now. He hates a loose chain." "I'll see to him," she said. They started for town at a walk. It wasn't far. But Merritt wanted dusk to have time to settle on Leland's swagger before words started climbing walls. Mrs. Granger squeezed Clara's hand at the porch and went to collect her shawl and bread knife and whatever else a woman carries when she volunteers herself into a fight. Clara stood in the yard while the men found the lower road. The day had polished itself into bright. The creek down by the cottonwoods made its soft, endless speech. She looked at the chain on the gate and lifted it, set it down, lifted it again, finding a better notch. The metal laid where she put it and held. By the time she and Mrs. Granger set out along the track, the sun had slid west enough to lay long bars of light across the road like jail turned inside out and laid on the earth, as a reminder that a person can walk through all the same. When the cottonwoods gathered and the water's sound grew full, they found the men where the road bent to ford. Merritt on his horse in the shallows, Leland at the bank talking too much, Deputy Cotter with his hat pushed back and his smirk wearing off now that the world had moved to fact. Jonah sat straight and easy in his saddle, hands bound, his eyes on the water, as if listening to the part of truth that belonged to it. "Sheriff," a voice called from across the creek. "Mr. Wells from the telegraph office, breathless, waving a paper like a flag. "You'll want this," came over the wire from Cheyenne, complaints stacked against Leland in 2 towns east. He was half stumbling through the shallows, splashing ink into the very thing that could save a man if he kept it dry. Merritt reached, caught the paper, shook off River with a snap, scanned the lines. The wind moved his coat. The badge blinked once. "Well now," he said, the weight of professional relief buried under the habit of caution. "Seems water don't just tell the truth, it carries it downstream when men forget to." Leland lunged. "That's slander," he started. And then his boot slid on the wet rock he'd chosen for grandstanding. He went to one knee with a splash, flailed for balance, caught Cotter's stirrup, dragged the deputy half around. The horses danced, the creak spoke louder, the paper snapped in Merritt's hand. The world condensed to a moment's bright point. Jonah's horse shifting, Jonah leaning, the cuff chain flashing as he moved to keep the deputy from going down hard, and taking Merritt with him, because some men cannot let other men fall wrong even when it would serve them. Cotter yelped. Leland grabbed higher, hand closing on Jonah's bound wrist iron on iron, and in the tangle looked up, found Clara on the far bank, and smiled a shard of victory like glass shoved under skin. "See?" he crowed at the watching world. "Violence." His foot slipped again. He went back, this time into water up to the thigh, and the creek took his breath with its honest cold and filled his words with it. The paper held. Merritt held. Cotter swore at both men and none, shaking his boot like a dog. Merritt closed the distance to Jonah in 3 clean steps of the horse and reached down. "Easy," he said to all of it. He tucked the wire into his breast pocket, tapped it once like a man tells a truth to stay put, and then looked at Leland the way a man looks at a problem he's measured and found solvable. "Victor Leland," he said, "you'll come along quiet for questioning on accounts east and west. Deputy, quit performing surprises and help the man out that water." Cotter scowled but obeyed. Leland sputtered to shore, dignity washed thin and clinging raw. Merritt turned back to Jonah, and with one flick of a key, loosed the cuff from one wrist, but left the other. "I ain't declaring a saint from a saddle," he said low, "but I can see who fell and who held. Town'll see it, too, if we give it the chance." Clara let her breath out. She hadn't known she'd been holding it until the world let her have it back. The sky was a blue cloth stretched tight. A single star would find it later and pierce it, for now the sun burned clean enough to show the truth without the help of heaven. "Sheriff," Cotter called, bristling with offended purpose. Procedure says we use sense," Merritt returned, "and I'm still the one renting sense to this county." He looked at Clara across the water. "Miss Whitmore, you feel like testifying in a room where the floor don't tilt?" "Yes," she said. Her voice did not shake. "I do." "Then we'll walk," he said. All of us. Slow enough for a person to think, quick enough for a liar to sweat. They turned toward Cottonwood together, law and grievance, witness and wound, a woman and a man who had refused to let her be counted like freight. The creek ran alongside, telling its plain, tireless story. Clara stepped onto the ford stone, felt it hold under her boot, and looked once over her shoulder at the line of pines on the ridge. In the needles she could see fire's old light. In the water, truth's patient shine. In the wide sky, clear now, save for the hawk riding circles, she could almost make out the small white pricks that would appear after sundown and hold until morning. And then, below the cottonwoods, where the shade thickened to a green secret, a rider she did not know eased a horse back behind Willow and waited, hat brim low, not part of Merritt's party or Leland's complaint. He kept to the still places, the way a man does who minds other men's business for hire. Clara's breath caught, then drew again. She looked at Jonah. He had seen nothing. He was watching the sheriff's pocket, where word on paper had become a kind of light. The ford stone rocked once under her foot. She took the next step, steady. The water ran clear over boot leather. On the far bank, the town waited with its saloon doors and church bell, and the room Merritt promised would be quiet until it wasn't. The rider in the shade nudged his horse into a deeper shadow and did not move. The road home took the long curve through cottonwoods, where the creek braided itself thinner and shallower, talking the whole way like a friend who means to persuade you back into believing. Jonah rode with one wrist still circled by iron, the other free. Sheriff Merritt had left it that way because he trusted sense more than show, but also because a deputy who wanted the clink to speak louder than truth was riding behind, and Merritt knew a sound sometimes kept trouble quiet. Clara and Mrs. Granger walked the bank. The water tugged at Clara's boot soles and murmured against the leather. Every time she looked up into the trees, she could see the place where a man had waited in shade that wasn't his. She felt the knowledge like a small, smooth stone in her pocket, weight enough to count, not enough to stop a person walking, provided you remembered it was there and didn't pretend you didn't feel it. By the time the ridge shouldered them toward home, the town lay behind with its measured talk and law, and the day had put on that late light that makes all things look briefly forgiven. The cuffs were gone by then. Merritt had slipped them loose without comment before he turned off for Cottonwood proper with Leland and Deputy Cotter fussing like a pair of crows arguing over a silver spoon. Give it the night, the sheriff had said to Clara and Jonah. Morning's good at washing a man clean of other folks' lies, and it don't mind getting its hands wet. They reached the yard as the sun slid into the saddle between two hills and let its last brass run across the fence rails. Star lifted his head from his hay and snorted hello like a story with the rude parts trimmed. The gate chain sat true where Jonah had set it that morning. The brace held. The scar where the night had come wasn't a wound anymore. Just a new line in the wood that meant someone had loved the place enough to bind it so it could go on. Jonah swung down and tied the bay in the shade that would belong to evening soon. Mrs. Granger, he said, I'm obliged for walking a road that ain't exactly a widow's business. Quote, everything's a widow's business, she said, with the ferocity of a woman who had made terms with loneliness and come out the better for refusing its worst bargains. I'll bring a pot over at dusk and leave it simmering until it thinks it's supper. If anyone knocks my door who shouldn't, I'll let my late Mr. Granger answer through his colt. She put a hand on Clara's sleeve, firm. Sleep if sleep comes. If it won't, don't fight it like a mule. Mend something small and let your mind trail you like a patient dog. Men's noise will settle when the fire's done, teaching them what to fear about the dark. When Mrs. Granger's boots had taken the road in their sure rhythm, and Tucker had tipped 2 fingers from where he sat, his sorrel in the cottonwoods, the old hand keeping watch without making a sermon of it, Jonah laid his palm flat on Star's shoulder and breathed once with the horse before turning to the house. Inside, the cabin had the particular quiet that comes after a day finds its end without taking anyone with it. The room was clean and ordered. The lamp waited, wick trimmed. The kettle stood ready with a hard-earned patience. On the table, the letters lay with the new creases of the sheriff's careful reading, sunlight finding their edges like a benediction before it slid off the wood. Jonah hung his hat, then shed his coat with a small wince he tried to hide and almost did. Clara saw the stiff way his shoulder moved before he could tuck it away. Sit, she said, the word out before she could tailor it into something gentler. He smiled out of the corner of his mouth. Ma'am, there's time to... Sit, she repeated, not sharper, just true. Please. He obeyed, lowering himself to the chair like a man who had made a habit of ignoring small hurts until they learned to ignore him. She moved closer. The room's breath warmed her skin, and the little wind that went in and out the window chink carried a pine note that said what all honest sense say, that the world is present and intends to remain. She set aside his shirt with careful fingers, unbuttoning where the cloth tugged. The dark bruise below his collarbone, no wider than her palm, had the new bloom of a kindness gone violent there where he'd taken the edge of the gate to keep Star from climbing through panic or pry. A graze ran narrowly along his upper arm, a gift from the creek's fast confusion when iron and men had tangled for a beat of the heart. He had not said a word of it. I've had worse pulling calves, he offered, as if to help her along the tight part of her breath. Fence taught me a dozen hymns I ain't inclined to sing. Turn, she said softly. He did. She cleaned the line of the graze with warm water and a linen square, working outward first, then inward, like a law of mercy. He didn't flinch. When she reached the deepest place, his breath hitched once and steadied again. Outside, a jay scolded some imagined villain, and then forgave it, and then remembered and scolded once more, like a town that doesn't know what to do with the truth when it doesn't come dressed up for church. "You took the water to the sheriff," she said. "The words in it. The way the creek told what men had done upstream." "I took paper," he corrected, gentle. "Water did its own carrying. Then after a small time, you stood. That part did more than the wire. A town reads a person standing the way it reads weather. Keeps an eye on what the sky really looks like, and not just on what the calendar says." She tied the bandage with neat hands. The knot sat true. He watched her fingers for a moment as if to memorize the pattern, in case he needed to make it himself later, and couldn't find the will to ask. "You're good at that," he said. "My mother's hands taught mine," she answered. "She sewed the hems of common days until, at the end, we had more cloth than grief." She cut the thread with the small scissors from the basket and set the roll of bandage back where it belonged. "I didn't think I would ever sew anything here that wasn't the story of my own mistake." "It ain't a mistake to seek a home," he said. "It's a sin to sell one to someone and hand her to a storm instead." Quote. He reached for his shirt, but she stayed him a moment and laid a palm to the unhurt part of his shoulder, the way a woman might settle a skittish thing, without needing to own it. He stilled. The fire's low crackle filled the little room. She withdrew her hand and helped the sleeve over the bandage, careful of his range. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" Her voice surprised her with its roughness. "For deciding your bones ain't glass," he said. "There's men who'd build whole houses around a woman's grief, just to keep her quiet in it. A breath. I ain't of that mind." She laughed then, not a bright peal, a low, weary thing that found its own strength in refusing to be pretty for its own sake. She fetched the coffee, poured it dark, and set the cups where they could claim them. When the words sat down, they ate from Mrs. Granger's pot as dusk took the window for itself, the stew thick with barley and a piece of salt pork that had given more than its share. Clara found herself wanting the simple mechanics of the meal to last. The lift of the spoon, the soft tap of tin on wood, the way a mouthful sent heat down into the hollows that cold had hollowed. Outside, the trees began to trade day songs for night ones. A coyote drew a thin streak of sound along the ridge, hungry and hopeful, all at once, then let it break, to let a star take the note up. When the bowls were clean, and the kettle did its breathy work, they sat nearer the hearth, not touching, not carefully not touching, just placed like two things a room had always meant to hold. The fire, patient and ordinary, threw its gentle light. It licked and settled and licked again, teaching as it had always taught, that wood becomes heat not by rage but by yielding itself even in long. Jonah stared into it with the look men get when they remember old rooms. "Emma liked the late logs best," he said. "Said the day forgave a body easier if the last thing she watched was a small piece of tree becoming something to keep her alive." He paused, as if listening backward for a long time to be sure he had the sentence right. "She died in winter." He did not say "I loved her." He stacked the facts so the love would show through it and not need a signboard. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "She carried her sorry quiet, so I learned to do the same." He gave a breath that was almost a laugh. "Don't always take." He glanced at the window. "I got good at naming weather. Still ain't much of a talker when it's people." "You said plenty to the creek," she said. "The creek listens," he returned. "People sometimes wait their turn to speak." He looked at her then, directly, but soft. "You ain't like the talking kind. You speak when there's a thing that needs the shape of your voice around it." She held his gaze a heartbeat longer than comfort wanted, then let it go the way you let a good horse go at the end of a ride, so he thinks it was partly his idea. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "In Cheyenne," she began, hands folded so the ragged edge of the nail on her little finger wouldn't tell on her, "a man I did not know came to the women's car and said rules had changed. He wore a badge I later learned wasn't his to wear. He had Leland's smell on him, cheap cologne on sour cloth. He told me decent women didn't travel alone, and decent men corrected it." Jonah's jaw worked once. He stared into the coals, as if they held a map of what needed doing to make that sentence untrue, and could be read if a man's eyes were willing to study long enough. "I got through it," she said, not a brag. "Sometimes getting through is as much victory as a person gets and more than some." He nodded once, a motion that carried a quiet vow, obeyed without a ceremony to pin it to. "You ain't alone in that car anymore." He lifted a hand as if to lay it over hers and stopped, not from fear of rejection, but from a refinement that belonged to men who understand that a woman's skin can be a church or a courtroom,